Alright, time for another Drafts to Science video presentation. Alright, this one will be sort of addressed to the Dr. Lincoln, okay? And just to acknowledge that this is what he's denying is an argument, okay? My video was substantially a counter-argument to what he was saying. Yes, there were a few insults thrown in, because frankly they deserve it, okay? And it's kind of shown in the sense that they obviously are very dismissive of any other theory, saying things like no particle model can ever explain or some kind of crap like that. And so they deserve to be hit a little bit hard just because their hyperbole, their exaggerations are so excessive. But anyway, regardless. So this is where we are now. I'm just making sure. Yes, it's recording. All right. So his comment to my comment, where I offer him the $2,000 to, do better. Let's see. Okay. I've shown, oh no, that's the math argument. Okay. So where was my... All right, you won't defend this statement with any references to anything called evidence. So, the statement is that I'm both a nut and a crank. And I'm somehow insanely arrogant or something. Okay. With anything called evidence. I've offered you $2,000 for the opportunity to show you how you were misguided. Okay, now that's the same rhetoric they use sometimes, just implying that you're an idiot. But the fact is one of us is an idiot. One of us is right and one of us is wrong. And I would say clearly one of us has very skeptical statements are made in his video, and that the statements made in my video are rock solid. They're true. They are facts. I'm citing facts. He's citing bullshit. That's a clear distinction. So do you think the bullshit adds up to the truth? Or do you think facts should add up to the truth? That's really the only part of this conversation that's really relevant. And that's a conversation worth having. I'm just saying he's so full of... He's obviously got the weaker argument. Just any fair-minded person would have to say, yes, he didn't provide any evidence for his argument. His statements were not backed up with anything that could be called an agreeable fact, one that we all know is true. And my statements are, there's just no denial. There's just no way to deny these statements as being truths. Okay, anyway. If it's just arrogance and no substance, why don't you take the money? You could show all the tinfoil hatters how strong your science is and get well paid to do it. Your future humiliation is now not my fault. Okay, so I'm just making it clear. You've been given the opportunity to recognize that this subject is deeper and that there's a lot more to it than what your superficial understanding allows you to see. That you are full of just crap. You're full of generalizations and cliches and fables. You don't have any real knowledge of the subject. And you're claiming high knowledge. I've clearly pointed out your errors and you refuse to acknowledge them. You have shown you have no integrity. So that's really the argument here, right? I mean, we can't have a conversation if you're all dishonest assholes, frankly. So if these people can't grow any integrity and be honest, then there can't be a conversation, right? I mean, the honest truth is it's a ludicrous proposition that I'm either crazy, okay, or whatever a crank is. I have spent, whatever it is, 10 years doing these videos. I've spent my whole life contemplating these questions. I'm clearly not doing whatever cranking is. I'm not doing this for the fucking fun of it. I'm not doing it as an antic. I'm not doing it because it's fun. This is all of such an idiotic accusation. Now, you want to argue that I'm wrong, then argue I'm wrong because I've used flawed logic or bad reasoning, or I've paid attention to bad evidence. That should be something you can point to. All right? I mean, you're the one who's accepting Leibniz theory, okay? The guy who overtly claimed, we must have physics that matches our religion. I'm defending Newtonian physics. You know, a guy who was a religious kook, but who knew the physics can't be blended into the religion. That physics and science is about defining what we can say, not what we wish to be the truth. Well, anyway, so this is really about integrity. He's obviously showing he has no integrity because he's just dismissing the argument with these silly accusations that he has some evidence that I'm a nut, that I'm not thinking properly, that I'm illogical. He's not arguing that I'm making a bad argument. He's arguing I'm not capable of making a good argument. I mean, it's just such a bullshit tactic. It's a weaselly move. Obviously weaselly. Okay. All right. So, no point in getting into the troll comments. The liars, the fakers. Okay. So now he says, this is Dr. Lincoln. Add at least 2 zeros. So 20,000 wouldn't be enough. $200,000 is his expectation. $200,000 on your offer for full consideration. All right, so this is just like all the other glib responses I've received, right? I mean, AB Science played silly games. You know, I'm offering him money. I'm saying, what's your price? He won't tell me his price. Okay, Baldy Cat's joked that he was worth 40 grand. Okay, and then he said, no, I'll do it for free. And then he agreed to do it, and then he backed out, obviously. I mean, he admitted, in a video that he really didn't know how to argue my arguments. So he was already looking for a way out. He was always looking for somebody else to take his place because he was already uncomfortable with what he had committed to. And then he just weaseled out, pretending I have some kind of philosophical views that are unacceptable. And therefore I can't participate in a physics discussion because I have unacceptable beliefs by his definition. All right, 2K is a bit on the embarrassing side. So these are people, just recognize, these are people who think $2,000 for less than an hour's work is embarrassingly unflattering to them. They think they're worth more than that, $2,000 an hour. They think they're worth it. They earned it. That should be their real salary. And this is to get in the door to their, well, as I'll point out, I'll read my comment, especially for giving visibility to something so disconnected from reality. So this is his statement. It's disconnected from reality to notice these specific points about these 2 experiments, to point out that the pattern is actually more complex than you showed, to point out that when you showed the single slit as a single dot, that was a terrible distortion of reality. I mean, that gives people an impression that it's fundamentally a different experiment when it's fundamentally the same experiment. It's fundamentally what Newton did. All right, Newton didn't find a big difference between the single impediment and the single slit. And all you're doing is combining those 2 experiments, duh. I mean, you're the one saying something disconnected from scientific fact, and yet you're throwing around these accusations. How despicable a character are you? You have no right to insult my intelligence, or to impugn my reputation, or to do any of this crap based on the evidence you have, because you don't have any. You haven't demonstrated in one way how you have a superior understanding, that you've seen more double slit experiments, or that you know anything more about the subject. In no way have you discounted any of the arguments I've used or any of the evidence I've provided. Nothing. You've done none of your obligation before you're allowed to say this kind of shit about somebody else. You're just behaving like a stupid, ignorant troll. All right. So this is one of the comments to one of the trolls, again, talking about how I should perform these experiments, right? So physics has been around for the 300 years since Newton, and I should do the experiments they haven't done. Yeah, I should do it. They don't have to do experiments. They don't have to prove anything. I do. I mean, it's just such hypocrisy. Anyway, so I say to Dr. Lincoln, you'll regret this weak, trite dismissal. But thanks for the ammunition. Your $200,000 entry fee to your ivory tower will make for easy mockery. Really. I mean, do any regular people think it should cost $200,000 to challenge one of these assholes to defend their physics? That they should be so immune that you should have to get $200,000 together before you can make a counter argument to their physics. They should be immune to having to answer any questions unless you can come up with $200,000. I mean, pathetic. All right. I mean, like all their exaggerations, like all their hyperbole. What a pile of crap that is. All right. Do you ever think about whether your father would be proud of you? So this statement triggered a few people, which I thought was kind of funny. Like somehow I would object to somebody saying that to me. And of course I wouldn't have object. I object when you do it 3 days after my father dies. Yeah, then I think it's a little bit rude. But we have no understanding that his father just died 3 days ago. So this is just a cliche way of saying, I mean, you know, if you're going to accuse somebody of not having integrity, and that's what I'm overtly doing, I'm saying he's demonstrating no intellectual integrity to play this ad hominem game. I will defeat you with ad hominem attacks. I will not in any way touch your actual arguments made. Okay, I'll make jokes about squirrels and shit. But I won't sit there and get anywhere near the subject. Okay, anyway. So I'm just trying to hit at his integrity. I mean, who raised you that you think you can dismiss an argument with this trite bullshit? Who taught you that? Where did you get the ethics to think that's how you win an argument? You know. I'm just saying it's the method of the gutless coward. And is that who raised you, a gutless coward? All right. You make claims on the internet fooling ignorant dupes, and you don't have the courage to defend them? Question mark. I mean, I'm paying you to defend them. Paying you very well. Most people would be very happy to make $2,000 for even a day's work. 1 day's work, $2,000. That's the kind of salary only the 1% get to earn. So, and you're going to call it nothing, meaningless. Okay, you are a profile in propaganda. So it's like profile in courage, propaganda, opposite things. So I guess we'll play with that and use it in the title somewhere. But anyway, so that was my final comment. Then Stephen Bro pops in here saying, somehow implying that using my family, and that is somebody using my people in my family as icons for their videos, is the same as me asking if somebody thinks their father would be proud of them. Somebody actually taking the image of my father and using it as an icon for their channel somehow is the same thing. So again, clueless lunatic. And the Captain Awesome thing, again, somebody else's name stolen by this stupid idiotic moron to play his games. I mean, it's just so it's so tacky that he's doing this on Dr. Lincoln's page. So he's defending physics by doing this kind of crap on you know, a science page. You know, fake accounts, stealing identities. Yeah, doesn't make any sense. I don't think that'll work, frankly. Yeah, it didn't fool me. So anyway, all right. So this is the argument that Dr. Lincoln is dismissing as crank and nut, okay, and just arrogant. Okay, so we'll go through this one more time. I shouldn't have to do this again. These facts prove the case. There's just no counter argument. So unless you can disprove one of these statements, you're stuck with the four source theory. You're stuck, okay, that the sources aren't in wave like positions, and the whole theory of waves interfering is inferior, okay, to an idea that they're just rays of photon. But anyway, all right, single slit facts. The single slit math models two vectors with point sources at the surfaces. So the distance between the two surfaces is the math. That's the math that works. That's where the wave centers have to be, because the vectors are drawn from those points. So clearly the waves have to be on the surfaces. So there shouldn't be any dispute that that's the math that's used, and that's the math that actually gets right answers, or close to it. Alright, so it's clear that any notion of whatever diffraction would be, or Huygens, it doesn't matter. The math clearly says the wave is here and the wave is here. And it is vectors from those waves that will be compared. Different vectors, different points will be created from those points. That, quite obviously, looks just like scatter at the surfaces. And we know that light is deflected going into transparent surfaces, so we know that surfaces can bend light. So those facts make it a little bit easy to say, what do we need the wave for? We really don't need it. But anyway, that's the location of the waves. The centers are here. The centers are not here. That math will not get the right answer. All right, that is the math models 2 waves diffracting waves. Models 2 diffracting waves, in quotes, because yes, obviously I don't believe in waves, with their centers at the surface. So that's where all the vectors go from. That's what creates the pattern. Okay, so if you disagree, point out some piece of evidence somewhere. And so I've labeled them 1, 2, 3, so you can just say, I don't agree with number 4 or something. Okay, so let's hear your argument. The math predicts models a result on a curved surface of radius L, target distance. Now this is one that everybody should have known. This should have been part of every conversation on the subject, right? I mean, there's really no way to excuse the fact that they never really pointed this out, that all these physicists didn't figure out something. I mean, it's this obvious, okay, that the mathematics is projecting what takes place in a place in space, and the key distance is, they would label it L, and the key distance L is one distance. It can't get any longer, so the L has to always be the same distance no matter where you're going. So when you're using 2 vectors to this distance, the mathematics is saying this is the point you're predicting, and this is the point you're predicting, and this is the point you're predicting. You are not predicting anything on a flat screen, okay? That's not the prediction. And clearly if they had done that, if they had pointed out that this is what the math is predicting, what happens on this curved line, then it would be obvious to everybody that, oh, wait a minute, it's not an infinite pattern, because each one of the nodes has a fixed size, and so they have to all fit on this one line. It's not an infinite plane going forever. There isn't pattern going forever and ever and ever. The pattern is finite, and it just makes it kind of obvious what the right answer is going to be. But again, not pointed out. Important fact, never mentioned in his analysis, certainly. Just to keep it mysterious. It's not mysterious. Once these facts are established, there's nothing mysterious at all about the double slit experiment. It's completely consistent with the single slit experiment, and there's nothing mysterious about the single slit. It's all quite obvious what's taking place. All right, number 3. The number of possible nodes locations of constructive or destructive interference is defined by how many wavelengths of light fit in the distance between the surfaces. So obviously this, which is always labeled D, not always. This is, well, sometimes they label it A, actually. But anyway, this distance, okay, that's, you just sit there and say how many wavelengths fit in there, because that's completely proportional to how many, this distance here of this triangle that you're going to be making. And there's only a certain number of places that can have where you're a wavelength difference. So you can just go and figure out there's only a certain number. That means there's only a certain number of nodes that are possible to create. So, and it's completely proportional. So what you're really doing is just saying, I'm going to take these notches, I'm going to put them on this bigger line, and they were going to get proportionally bigger on the bigger line. So I just take this notch and put it here. I just take this notch and put it here. And I just take this notch and put it here. I just take this one and put it on, and so on and so on. And that'll tell me exactly where the nodes are of on and off. Takes all of the mystery out of it. All right, dividing the wavelength into the distance. So you just divide the wavelength into the distance between the surfaces. You get a number like 15.7, okay, let's say, or 15. Will tell you exactly how many on-off nodes will be projected onto the curved surface. And so whatever number fit here has to fit on this entire longer line. That's simple. Very simple. All right, number 4. The path length difference at 90 degrees is the total distance between the surfaces and dictates what the node at 0 degrees will be. Now that one, if I just say it in words, might confuse somebody, as nodes are equally sized. But it's really just saying that, you know, once you understand that you're just trying to find you're trying to find lines, you're trying to make lines, okay? Let's see if we can get rid of some of this. Well, let's just redraw it. Okay. All right. So you're just comparing two vectors. So you're saying here's a point in space. I want to know what it's doing. I just take these two lines and I just say, okay, is this line a whole number of wavelengths? That is a whole wavelength, no half a wavelength. It's a whole wavelength bigger than this one, or two whole wavelengths bigger than this one. Then that point will be an on, okay, because it's a whole wavelength. That means it stayed in phase. Whole wavelength means there's three things here, and they're out of alignment like this, okay, by whole wavelength. So they still match the pattern. It's just that they are out of exact sequence, but they're out of sequence by a whole wavelength versus something like, you know, this, which would be out of phase, you know. All right, and the point that's going to be guaranteed is this one at 90 degrees. So at 90 degrees, okay, you have a guarantee that the path length difference between this line and this line will be the entire distance. So whatever that distance is tells you what the node is here. So if you divide the wavelength into the distance and you get a non-even number, or you get a remainder like 15.5 or something, that's going to tell you, okay, it's obviously not a full wavelength, so it's going to be an off right here. And if you know this is the center of an off, then you know this is going to be an on here. Well, I should draw them differently. Offs are X's and ons are O's. And then you're just going to say this has to be an X, and then this will be an O, and then this will be an X, and this will be an O. And so this top one is going to be dictated by this bottom one. Okay, the one at 90 degrees is going to dictate what remainder you have here at the top. And the top really isn't going to be, well, the top is way over here. Anything to do with this. This only happens inside of a tiny space. Well, that's the next number, so let's not jump ahead of ourselves. All right, the path length difference at 90 degrees, right? So, okay, number 5. The equidistant vectors pointing to the center do not create real nodes. So if I take the two slits are less than a millimeter apart. If I take those two lines and go to a center, I'm going to a center still inside of that less than a millimeter. And so whatever that illusion that they're equidistant, that is, they have the same number of wavelengths inside of them, is just that, an illusion. It doesn't have anything to do with the real pattern that's being created, okay, by lines that are going in the same direction. And that's the way to understand it. So I could draw that quickly. I've done it before, but we'll do it again just to make it clear. All right, that when you do this, okay, that's inside of 1 millimeter on the target. The target's going to create a huge pattern that these things are, you know, could be a foot. okay, of distance. And you're talking about 1 tiny millimeter will be an on. But the rest of the pattern was dictated by these lines. Okay, and these lines going this way, both going the same way. And those lines are outside of that 1 millimeter. That's where they start. And they create nodes here and here. Okay, depending on how you started. Okay, so that's where this is a deception. This doesn't happen in the real pattern, in the real world. It only happens inside of 1 millimeter. So they always say it, right? Professor Slaney says, it's non-negotiable that the center maxima is an on. When, yeah, it is negotiable. Okay, because that's inside of 1 millimeter. So yes, it's on inside of 1 millimeter, but it could be off right next to that. Because the off is going to be these two lines. And depending on this distance, this can be a half a wavelength right here, 1 millimeter away. It's a half a wavelength difference. It could be an off right next to that on, that 1 millimeter on. And so that's why the center maxima is bigger, is because it's actually more than one node. It's two nodes. See, at this point, 1 millimeter away could be the center of this point, 1 millimeter away. So the two nodes could be over each other, or they could be separated by a little tiny bit of distance. But those are your choices. But it's two nodes that are essentially, because the center is filled in. So it looks like one node, but it's double sized. All right. Okay, so the equidistant vectors pointing to the center do not create real nodes. So they're not the ones you're going to see. Let's put it that way. As part of the diffracted, the spread pattern, the pattern that's getting magnified by distance will not be inside that 1 millimeter. That 1 millimeter doesn't get magnified with distance. It's not the pattern. It's not part of the fringe pattern. All right. As they only span the tiny distance, the distance between the two surfaces at the target. So it's a tiny percentage of a node that the two lines are pointing towards each other fit in. A tiny percentage of one node. Okay, real vectors move in the same left-right direction. So the way you can see it is that after 1 millimeter of distance, the two lines, the two vectors go in the same direction. The same direction. And this fake, when they're going in opposite directions, is just that, a fake. All right. The experiment is easily modeled with a 2L length of string attached to the 2 point sources and marked in wavelength increments. So you can't actually physically model the real dimensions of a photon, but you could come up with a proportional model, okay? And you'd have to make some cheats, just because you aren't going to be able to physically model the huge difference between the wavelength of light and many hundreds of feet of distance. You know, the L and the wavelength of the light are such hugely, dramatically different numbers that you obviously can't build a model that can see both of those things. It can't show both a tiny millimeter of space and thousands of feet of space. So you can't make a perfect model. But the idea is that the 2 point sources, if you just attached a string, okay, to the 2 point sources and made it 2L distance, then you could just move that across this arc, and it will, if you just put the notches of this distance, right, the wavelength number, if you just put those notches on the string, you'll watch the notches move, and they will mark exactly where the notches line up as where there's a in phase. And you can just mark right on the arc, proportional arc. So if you just say this arc is going to be 6 miles. I mean, it could be 6 miles of arc at huge distances. I'm just saying, so all you're doing is making, the model will show you. All you need to know as long as you get this number proportional to this length. So as long as if this is 10 to 1, okay, here, then it just has to be 10 to 1. And so as long as you model these two things in the same dimensions, you can just figure out the pattern by just physically moving the string. Fact. All right, so that's the single slit. Those are the important facts. I don't think there's any other fact that's terribly important. That really covers all the stuff that you need to know. And now the double slit is just simply saying what's the difference. And the difference is pretty simple. So anyway, the double slit experiment is just two single slit experiments superposed on top of each other. So it really is just as, you would attempt to solve it in the past, and there's just such a simple mistake. I mean, this is always, people should say, oh, well, it can't be two superimposed patterns because the two patterns aren't the same patterns as the slits are creating. But that's the catch. The pattern the slits are creating isn't what happens when you merge them. When you merge them, they composite into something new. They mix. So some ingredients, you can mix them and they'll stay separate, oil and water. But sometimes you can mix ingredients like water and alcohol or something, and they'll mix and it'll become something different. It's probably a better example of a difference. But anyway, so you're not merging this experiment with this experiment. What you're doing is creating this experiment and this experiment. You're moving this outside surfaces into each other, and you're moving these inside surfaces into each other. So when you're merging the two slit experiment, when you're taking the two single slit experiments, this single slit experiment and this single slit experiment, what you're really creating is this single impediment experiment and this single slit experiment out here. These will be the distances. That will be the distances realized in the new pattern. Okay, D1, D2. These distances will be the surface differences. And it'll be kind of obvious that this small one, okay, creates big blobs. And this large distance creates little ones. And where you have little ones and big ones matching, you'll get light, and where they don't match, you won't get light. And it's that simple. I mean, that simple difference in how you look at it. You're not merging these two openings, the pattern they create. You're merging the pattern, this surface relative to this surface, and you're making this into this. And you're making this outside stuff way out here into this. And that's really what you're merging. These two surfaces and these two surfaces. And that tiny change in perception makes all the difference in terms of making it completely understandable. All right. All right, the double slit experiment is just two single slit experiments superposed on top of each other. Not two single slits of the same dimension, so that is not two openings, but really you're combining the two openings and making a center impediment and two outside surfaces. And those are the things that are going to produce the vectors. But rather a composite product of the single slits with the dimensions of the center impediment and the single slit with the dimensions of the outside surface. So those are the two you're really mixing, the outside surfaces and the inside surfaces. The double slit is combining two source experiments. So they're both sources, two sources for the single slit, two sources for the single slit, four sources for the double slit. And by combining the sources, you're changing the vector distances. Where the four sources are in phase, there is construction of a photon. When all four sources are not in phase, no photon is recorded. And that's the simple solution. So Dr. Lincoln doesn't think any of this is relevant. He doesn't think these are points that need to be appreciated, that these facts don't lead to a reasonable conclusion regarding the phenomenon, that somehow it's more reasonable to believe that photons split into two and are entangled and bang into each other and interfere and do all this stuff. That's more reasonable. When this is more reasonable, obviously. He can't refute a single one of these arguments, and all of these arguments point out the reality that none of their logic makes any sense. Clearly, the single slit is the two-source experiment. Clearly, the double slit has to be the four-source experiment. Once you analyze the four sources and draw the vectors and draw them on a curved line, you will recognize that there's no choice. The waves have to be on the surfaces, and if you put them there and you honestly do the vector math, you will conclude that, yes, kind of obviously, there's no need for intersection, there's no need for destruction, none of that needs to exist, and all you have to do is have photons that are composite objects that can be broken, and all you're doing is putting them back in phase and reconstructing a photon. Yeah, that's probably enough. I mean, I could get into the radar comparisons, because then you can get the idea that the energy is still hitting all the surface. The surfaces are all getting hit with the same amount of energy, the same number of little pieces. And it's just the places where you put the photon back in the right sequence that it's a photon, and where it's not the right sequence, it's not a photon. A photon is identified as something that has a consistent period between the elements of the photon. And if you don't have a consistent frequency, it can't do what photons do. The photon is broken. The energy isn't broken, just the photon. All right. Yeah, I mean, I could say more of the stuff I've already said that he's discounting as being crank and nutty. So there's somehow it's crank and nutty to point out how these facts point to a very different truth being the truth than the one they're selling. They're selling an argument where a bunch of complex stuff has to happen, when it's clear that what's happening is really simple. It's not complicated. It's not mysterious. And all you have to do is account for why the surfaces are important. What can surfaces do to a photon? Well, you just ask the question, what's on a surface? Electrons. What are electrons famous for doing to photons? Oh, scattering them. There, the mystery is solved. All right. Yeah, like I said, well, I've made these arguments so many times. I really shouldn't have to keep making them. I really shouldn't have to put them in, I really shouldn't have to do all of this to demonstrate that his argument that I am saying something irrational or dismissible or irrelevant or meaningless or crazy or silly or ludicrous or nonsensical, that accusation is completely unfounded. He has no excuse for making it. The only reason why he did it is because he's afraid of the argument. He doesn't want to have to deal with the fact that he has wrong, that he made a misleading nonsense video, and he should take account of that and accept responsibility and do his job to science and appreciate the fact that no, he's the one who misunderstood. He's the one who's ignorant. And he didn't really appreciate that, that this subject needed better analysis. Not even more analysis, just better analysis, because it's all full of fabology. Richard Feynman had no detector experiments. There was no evidence anybody did any of these experiments. All of their conclusions were based on just made up nonsense, rather than just drawing it on a board and saying, what do the vectors do? Because as soon as you start drawing the vectors, you should realize that, wait a minute, I have to draw it on a curved line because I can't change L. L has to be the same length. I can't change L. can't change the length, the distance from the target. So I can't draw it on a flat surface. I can't draw the vectors to a flat surface. That would be unscientific. That would be an error. Anyway. All right, enough. It really should be enough. So anyway, till the next time and such. So go ahead. So somebody tell me which one of these points made here is wrong, is incorrect, is somehow provably incorrect. And where's your evidence of it being incorrect? Where's your evidence supporting some theory that it's incorrect? So anyway, till the next time and such. Oh, yeah, I did forget the whatever. I forgot this thing just because, look, it's, I can do it, so I'm going to do it just because I can. It is kind of neat. Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, the end of the video and such. Roar. Roar. There. End of the video.